The first two Sundays of Advent are about the second advent of Jesus, the consummation of God's plans for the world. We read from Matthew 24, starting at 36. But about that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, and until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field. One will be taken, one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together. One will be taken, one will be left. Keep awake, therefore. You do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this. The owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake. He would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. The reading ends here. I'm going to emphasize the Old Testament readings again, but we'll touch a bit on the New Testament readings if we have time. Those of you who have been to New York, I bet, visited the United Nations and its plaza. If you have, you'll recall a large statue. And it is the words that we just heard from Isaiah and Micah. One day peace will reign and the weapons will be turned into instruments of peace. Swords will be beaten into plowshares. Spears into pruning hooks. The surprise of that statue is its date and provenance. Its provenance is from the Soviet Union in 1959. These are the days of Khrushchev. These are the days of "we will bury you." Some of you, well, a couple of you might be old enough to remember Khrushchev beating his shoe on the lectern there in the United Nations. The formerly atheistic Soviet Union, the great supplier of money to the late Fidel Castro in his regime in Cuba, gave this great statue sculpture in the name of peace in front of the United Nations. That vision of peace then extended into 2,700 years of human history. Later, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union, to my amazement, started crumbling of its own weight. Its rigid repression started to totter and crack. And the nations that it had held under its boot heel for a generation, for longer than I had been alive, started to totter and crack. In East Germany, the people started to rebel. They had to do so quietly and in secret. And so they did. They met in churches. They called it free space. And they had visions of a world without the Stasi, the secret police. A vision of peace and freedom. On their belt buckles, on their t-shirts, on their lapels, they had the words that we heard this morning. Swords into plowshares. Spears into pruning hooks. I showed Keegan this morning a picture of a sculpture made entirely of weapons of war. Our nation bristles with guns, and yet the words of Micah ring true and provide a vision for us all. Swords into plowshares, I'll try that again, spears into pruning hooks. 2,700 years after the vision of Micah and Isaiah, we are far from peace, but the vision continues to propel us. We are far from the inner peace that may be hinted at in Psalm 122. Or maybe it's a both and, the prayer for peace within the walls of Jerusalem could also be a prayer for peace within the hearts and minds of the friends and relatives of Psalm 122. Violence continues to grip our thoughts and our emotions. Not long ago in Rotary, I heard the newly elected state's attorney talk about his number one agenda item. Was it drugs? Was it crime? No. It was getting guns in as many hands of people as humanly possible. Violence erupts constantly in our homes, in our neighborhoods. Brutal violence stalks our people, locally and far away. We can't open a newspaper without being aware of it. East St. Louis is a cauldron of violence. St. Louis, by some measures, where we're going to have our General Assembly in, a year and a half, will be held in St. Louis, by some measures, the most dangerous, larger city in America. When I went to see my daughter in Austin, there was a murder across the street from where I live. More recently, we had this. If I don't go to Duke's Bakery, I travel along 7th and Spring Street sometime from Upper Alton to come to church. At 10 in the morning was an open shootout there by Cops Bar. People lined up with guns on each side of the street. Peace seems so far away, so elusive. Paul reminds us that our enemies are not flesh and blood alone, but that we as Christians are in a constant struggle against destructive powers that seek to enslave us. And perhaps no power on earth enslaves us more than violence. But we certainly have a lot of things that attack our sense of peace, prosperity, and security. Remember, all those words, health and well-being, are wrapped around the idea of shalom, Hebrew for peace, prosperity, security. It can be a history of mistrust and injustice. It can be an addiction. It can be our thirst for revenge, our prejudice, our fear, our greed. The list is long and seemingly endless. Paul calls these the works of darkness. Maybe better, the world of darkness. Those powers cast us under their spell and their pall all the time. P-A-L-L, Paul. We often act in petty ways that manifest those powers. They all erode our relationships. They all erode what can only laughingly be called neighborhoods in our time. Violence is an idea that is indeed a work of darkness, but it exists against real flesh and blood. So our struggle for peace is of two places. We struggle against the mindset of war and violence, and at the same time, work to try to keep people safe and healthy and well. We're able to do it because we're motivated by visions of peace, as we just heard. We wait, we work for a more peaceful time. Matthew 24 tells us that we need to be alert, on guard, at work with God's ways in the world, what Paul calls putting on light, putting on our baptismal garment of peace. Paul tells us to live in the armor of light. What a remarkable image. Paul uses military language all the time, and for that he gets criticized. But of course, those criticisms are ill thought out, in this case anyway. He uses military language for non-violent purposes and means. Against the world of flesh and blood, the armor of light is invisible and immaterial. It's nothing. How many divisions has the Pope? Stalin asked. Paul says, live in the armor of light. What a great image. The armor of all that opposes violence and the dark arts of war and suffering. I think of the beam of light in the Lord of the Rings movie, when at the last minute the wizard Gandalf appears with the troops and the evil creations disappear in fear and trembling before the light that exposes their empty darkness. Be alert, be on guard, Jesus says. I would have followed this exactly just yesterday. I've been sick forever and broke down and went, but my doctor keeps saying, it's viral, you'll get over it. I've been sick for a month, so bag him. And so I went to the ReadyMed place up in Godfrey and got a prescription, took it immediately, almost started feeling better by the evening. I went to take my next pill this morning. I have an old car, I usually leave it open. I had left the pills momentarily in my car. They were gone. It's not the first time I've had medicine stolen from me by the CVS in Upper Alton. But, as Jesus said, a smart person would have locked his car if he had it in there. A smart person will continue to keep their eye out for God's way of peace and everything that opposes it. Parker Palmer says that if we want social change for peace and against violence, we need a soul change. He's right to an extent. We need to change the way we look at ourselves and each other in regard to violence. But he's wrong, of course, if he thinks that only an individual conversion will be enough. Violence depends on joint action. So will peace. Christians are called, all of us, to work toward God's vision of peace. We are called to make the world a fit place for God to dwell, for peace to dwell within the walls of our city or the human heart and soul. Miroslav Volf, a theologian who knows violence from his home Balkans, wrote this: Christians believe that the day is coming on which our past, marred by wrongdoing and violence, will be bathed in the warm light of God's truthful, grace. Psalm 122 ends with words of peace. I love its vision that the nations, along with Isaiah, including our enemies, will be drawn like a magnet to Jerusalem. And Israel one day will fulfill its ancient hope of being a blessing to all nations, not only its own. That is its ancient purpose. Psalm 122, I'm sure you heard David read, was a psalm of ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T. On pilgrimage, people would read a different psalm every day from 120 to 130 on the way to Jerusalem. When they finally got to the temple area, they read one psalm or recited one psalm for every step they took to the house of the Lord. Usually when people approached Jerusalem, it was for a march of conquest. But the Bible imagines a peace march of pilgrimage, of worship, of learning. Let us walk, it says, in the light of the Lord. A progressive country singer, Steve Earle, who knows about violence and addiction and imprisonment, wrote a song called Jerusalem. I'll close with his words. A modern psalm, if you will. Well, maybe I'm only dreaming. Maybe I'm just a fool. But I don't remember learning how to hate in Sunday school. But somewhere along the way I strayed, and I never looked back again. But I still find some comfort now and then. Then the storm comes rumbling in, and I can't lay me down. But I believe there'll come a day when the lion and the lamb will lie down in peace together in Jerusalem. And there'll be no barricades then. There'll be no wire walls. And we can wash all this blood from our hands and all this hatred from our souls. And I believe that on that day, all the children of Abraham will lay down their swords forever in Jerusalem.